Hi, I'm Jeremy of Team Southwest. Today I'll be discussing tides and how they relate to saltwater fishing. Tides are one of the most basic elements of saltwater fishing that every angler needs to understand, and one of the pieces of the puzzle that helps you determine fish patterns and movements. Tides can be extremely confusing, especially for beginning saltwater anglers. I know when I first started saltwater fishing, I had a real difficult time trying to comprehend what tidal movement was and what it meant to where I was fishing. It took me years to finally grasp the concept. So hopefully this video helps clear some of that confusion up. Let's get started. Alright, I'm going to start off with some tidal basics and explain what high and low tide are and what they mean. Our tides are caused by the sun and moon's gravitational pull on the earth. There are also other factors that affect our tides, such as the wind, but I'll get into some more detail about other factors a little later. Let's start off by looking at a simple tide chart. The point of reference I'm going to be using here today is Galveston Pleasure Pier for June 29, 2010. Today's a two-tide day. High tide is at 7:29 a.m. this morning with a height of 1.98 feet above mean level. Low tide is at 11:48 p.m. this evening with a height of 0.01 feet below mean level. Today's range is 2.24 feet, which is the difference between the highest and the lowest water level for a given day. And the average monthly range is 2.32 feet for the month of June. High tide is basically the point over the course of a tidal cycle where the water is at its highest, and low tide is the complete opposite. Now let's look at the tide graph for the information I just showed you. And here's a graphical representation for all the data I just talked about. And as you can see, high tide right around 7:30 in the morning, and low tide right over here in this corner just before midnight. Two things you can notice right off the bat when you're looking at this tide chart is these steep inclines here, both here and here. Early in the morning there's going to be a real steep, strong incoming tide, and then it's going to slack off over the course of the day until there's a steep outgoing tide in the evening. And these are going to be your areas of your most tidal movement over the course of the day, both here in the morning and here in the evening. And right here in the middle of the day, there's not going to be much tidal movement. From the tide only moves maybe around 6 inches from here to just about right over here. Next, we're gonna go in a little more depth on how to read tide charts and interpreting the information. Now we're gonna take a look at a few different tide charts and see the differences between them. This is the one I showed you earlier for Galveston Pleasure Pier, and this one shows you predicted tides. What this one doesn't show you is what the tides are actually doing. This one just shows you what the tides should be doing. Another chart I like to use is the NOAA's chart. And they got a lot of good information on their website. This one's also for the Galveston Pleasure Pier. And the difference between this chart and the last chart I showed you is this one shows observed tidal levels versus predicted tidal levels. And as you can see, the blue line is the predicted tidal levels, which is the same graph that I showed you in the last chart. The red line is the observed or actual tidal level. And as you can see, the observed tide is running quite a bit higher than the predicted tide. And if you look up here in this, on the top of the graph, it's showing an observed height of 2.78 feet above mean level with a predicted height of 1.17 feet above mean level. And these are real-time figures here. And which is a pretty big discrepancy. And what this means is we have over 1.5 feet of water in our bays than what they predicted we were going to have. And I'll get into more detail about what caused this discrepancy a little later. Now we're going to take a look at why there's such a big discrepancy between the observed tide and the predicted tide. There are a number of factors that affect our tides here on the Texas coast. One of the major ones is the wind, and we're going to look at a wind graph to help illustrate what I'm about to talk about. But here's the wind graph for the same tide chart I was showing you earlier. And as you can see in this wind graph, over the course of the day, the winds have picked up to strong easterly direction winds. And what an east wind does to our bay system is blow a lot of water into our bays, as does a southerly direction wind. North and west winds have a tendency to blow a lot of the water out of our bays. And that's why in the wintertime, when we get those strong northerly fronts that have a really strong north winds, it flushes out our bays almost completely, where the tides are running really, really low levels. And in the springtime, when we have really strong southerly direction winds, our tides are running a lot higher than normal. I had a first-hand experience with this the other day. I have a marsh I like to fish on a low tide, and I was looking over the tide charts, and they were calling for an extremely low tide early in the morning. And usually around full new moons, we have exaggerated tides where we have really high highs and really low lows, and there's a lot of water movement. And this particular day was right around a full moon. And when I got to this particular spot, the tide was probably about 6 inches higher than I anticipated it being. And by the time I left, it was probably close to a foot higher. And 6 inches might not seem like a lot of water, but in this particular marsh, there's so much backwaters and marsh that these fish have a lot more area they can roam in when the tide comes up just a little bit higher. And it makes it a lot more difficult to locate these fish. And when the tide goes out, there's one area within this particular marsh system that's just a little bit deeper. And all those fish get sucked out of that surrounding marsh when the tide goes out, and they get sucked in this one particular pond, and all the bait fish and predatory fish are all going to be in there. And it makes it a lot easier to locate them because they'll be schooled up, or they'll be chasing bait fish, and you can spot them a lot easier. And if I would have known that the tide was going to be that much higher before I got there, I would have went somewhere else and fished elsewhere. And that's one thing you have to pay attention to when you're fishing marsh systems or just shallow water in general is a small difference in tidal fluctuation can make a huge difference on where those fish are going to be located within a particular marsh or within a flat or wherever you're fishing. So, I mean, that's one thing I like to look at on a regular basis. I usually look on this almost daily, is look at tidal patterns and see what the tide's doing over the course of the week or the course of the day, a few days before I'm going fishing. And you really have to pay attention to that, especially if you're fishing shallow water. Deep water doesn't make that much of a difference. Not that big of a difference, but when you're fishing shallow water and searching for redfish in particular, it makes a huge difference on where you're fishing. And the example I showed you earlier was a little exaggerated just because we have that storm in the Gulf right now. So, I mean, but it got my point across, so you can see what I was talking about. And another thing to keep in mind is the tide weakens as it gets further back to the marsh and the further away from a pass. So say you have 2 foot of water movement at the pass, and you're miles and miles away from that pass, way back in this marsh system. The tide may only be a foot in that marsh, whereas it was 2 foot at that particular pass.